the state and defense have now rested their cases. The attorneys now will present their final arguments. Please remember, again, that what the attorneys say is not the evidence or your instructions on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding this case. Each side has equal time, but the state is entitled to divide their time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defense has spoken. I will tell you that this packet of information is the jury instructions, which myself and the lawyers have spent time together while you weren't here working on. We all know what it says. We've all agreed to what I'm going to read to you. So it's not anything that they don't know, nor is it anything they don't already have a copy of. You all will get a copy of it when I read it to you. So if they reference, the judge will tell you this or the judge will tell you that about an instruction, they would not mislead you. They know what I'm going to read to you, so listen carefully, okay? State, you may proceed.
Good. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's been a long few weeks, and I told you at the beginning of this case that we would present evidence that proved that this defendant was guilty of first-degree murder of Margaret Brown, Nicolas Lonard, Greg Brown, and Megan Brown. And I submit to you that at this point, that has been done. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed a whole lot about yet is what do we need to prove in order to prove murder in the first degree in the state of Florida? So I'm going to talk to you about some of that. So in the state of Florida, and the judge will instruct you on the law later, but I expect she's going to tell you something similar to this, that there are two forms of homicide in the state of Florida. And you heard Dr. Palma tell you homicide is when one person kills another person. In Florida, there is lawful homicide and unlawful homicide. Lawful homicide finds itself in two categories. Justifiable homicide, which is a fancy way of saying self-defense, and excusable homicide, which is a fancy way of saying accident. And I submit to you, as we'll talk about, this situation is neither one of those. So then you're in unlawful homicide. And there are different degrees of murder in unlawful homicide, and I suspect you'll be instructed on a couple of them, but in particular, the defendant in this case has been charged with murder in the first degree. Now, what we need to prove in order to prove murder in the first degree is three elements. And I'm going to start with Nicolas Lonard because he's count one, but it would be the same three elements for each victim, with the only difference being the victim's name. So the first element would be for Nicolas Lonard that Nicolas Lonard is dead. And we all agree on that. There's a stipulation. The defense agrees that the body examined by Dr. Palma is Nicolas Lonard, and the same is true for the other three victims. So we all agree on the first element of all four counts. The second element is that the death was caused by the criminal act of the defendant. And we'll talk about that some more, but clearly by this time, the defendant has now admitted that he is the cause of all four of the deaths. And then the third element is that there was a premeditated killing of the victim. This example I'm using Nicolas Lonard. So let's talk about what premeditation means in the state of Florida. Killing with premeditation is a killing after consciously deciding to do so. The decision must be present in the mind at the time of the killing. The law does not fix the exact period of time that must pass between the formation of the premeditated intent to kill and the killing. The period of time must be long enough to allow reflection by the defendant. The premeditated intent to kill must be formed before the killing. So, premeditation is not a situation where you need to plan things out and have an escape plan and know exactly what's going to happen and how you're going to go about it. It just means that you did it with the intention to do it and you had some opportunity to reflect upon that decision. And I use this example to explain the idea of reflection. Now, we've all been driving on the road, coming on that traffic light, it's green, and then as you get closer it turns yellow. And we all think, Do I stop or do I go? And every one of us has at some time or another made a decision and reflected on that decision multiple times within the split second that it takes you to get from one point to the point where you are either in the intersection or stopped at the intersection. So it does not take a long time to reflect upon that decision to kill. And in this case, with each of these homicides, each of these murders, we see multiple indications that the defendant not only had the ability to reflect, but did reflect. So, justifiable use of deadly force. And I'm going to walk you through a lot of the evidence. I prepared some slides before I knew that the defendant was going to admit to killing all four of the people. I will skip through some of them, but justifiable use of force. Even if you believe everything that the defendant told you, and I submit to you there is significant problems with believing most of the things that he told you, even if you believe that, he is still guilty of first-degree murder for each of these four people. Starting with Nicolas Lonard. According to his testimony, which, by the way, is not consistent with what Dr. Palma says, Nicolas Lonard would not have been incapacitated by the knife wounds he received as quickly as the defendant would like you to believe. But according to the defendant, he leaves Nicolas Lonard, and then he comes back, gets a hammer, and just bashes in his head, hitting him more than 21 times or more. There's no self-defense there. According to the defendant, Nicolas Lonard is defenseless on the ground, not fighting back. And with each swing, he's got to make an intentional action up, an intentional action down with a great amount of force. So he knows exactly what he's doing as he hits Nicolas Lonard again and again and again and again. And you can see the photographs of the injuries. One of the reasons that we put those in is so that you see Nicolas Lonard has injuries all over his head. Nicolas Lonard is trying to fight with the defendant while he's getting hit, trying to avoid the blows, unlike what the defendant tells you. And that's why he gets hit all over his head. But even under the defendant's story, he is still guilty of murder for Nicolas Lonard. Gregory Brown. Under the defendant's story, this defendant actually pursues and goes to Gregory Brown to shoot him. There's no stand your ground there. There's no he came and attacked me. If what he says is true and Gregory Brown attempted to shoot at him in the bedroom earlier, then this defendant loses all self-defense claims once he runs after Gregory Brown to confront him in that closet. And so the shooting there is an intentional act, and not just one, but two, is also murder in the first degree. Now, Megan Brown, again, by this defendant's own claim, he has no reasonable fear that she has done or is doing anything that would cause him harm. Now, he may claim to have unreasonable fear, but Megan Brown standing there holding his cell phone and not saying anything, not doing anything, hiding behind the corner, according to his story, that is still murder in the first degree. And finally, Margaret Brown, he has absolutely, not even a shred of a claim for self-defense or accident. He goes down there with the hammer, knowing she's arriving home, knowing she wasn't home, and then he proceeds to beat her in the head over and over and over again. And he slipped up when he was trying to get his story out, but he slipped up because you may recall during a lot of testimony, I brought out Margaret Brown, when they found her body, did not have any shoes on. She wasn't wearing shoes. And we didn't find her shoes. And the defendant admitted that he had thrown away her shoes, and I asked him about it, and I said, you threw away her shoes because while you're trying to tie up her feet, she kicked off the shoes, right? And he agreed, yeah, that's what happened. Which is very different than the story he was trying to sell to you guys. It's because it did not happen the way he wants you to believe it did, and he was actually beating Margaret Brown, trying to subdue her, trying to tie her up, keeping that bag over her head. She's wrestling with him, kicking off her shoes, which she's tying with her shoelaces, and then he beats her with a hammer in the head. And that is murder in the first degree. Now, I submit to you, the way he describes it happened is not the way it happened. He needs Margaret Brown to be last, and if Justin Oakins is wrong, if Justin Oakins just happened to hear similar caliber shots from the direction of the house at a time of night that we would expect the shootings to have occurred, if all that just happened to be the case, and it happened to concern him enough to turn around, but had nothing to do with this incident, then maybe the way the defendant is telling you the order of the people is correct. But I submit to you, because of Justin Oakins, and Justin Oakins hearing those shots coming from that direction of a caliber firearm that is consistent with what we now know was used to shoot the different shots in that residence, then we know that Margaret Brown had to be first. Margaret Brown was first to be killed, because that's the defendant snuck in behind her when she arrives home from Wawa and attacks her and is trying to subdue her and tie her up so that he can get upstairs to kill everybody else. Now, I created a calendar for you guys to show where the defendant was during this time period, but the defendant has now admitted to being there during the killings and during the subsequent period afterwards. But even had he not, you know, this defendant is the only one there throughout the week other than a 4-year-old child. So we knew, we already knew, without the defendant telling us, that the murders had to have occurred on August 28th. We knew that because Gregory Brown is found in the same clothes he was wearing on August 28th. He's got the items that he had on his person, or would have had on his person that day. And we know that Margaret Brown was not killed until after she arrived home. She didn't leave Wawa until 11:10 p.m. And it's actually, if you watch the surveillance, it's closer to 11:11. So 15 minutes approximate back home, that's going to be right around 11:30 at night. And even if you believe what the defendant says, that is a good 4 hours after he claims the other murders would have happened. There is no justification for killing Margaret at that point. But again, I submit to you that Margaret probably would have first. And we knew Nicolas Lonard's truck gets dumped in the parking spot sometime the night of August 28th going into August 29th, because it was not there on the 28th. It appears there very early on the 29th. Now, in terms of the canal, and there's a couple things that you can draw from this out. We knew already that most of these weapons belonged to Greg Brown. We knew that Greg Brown kept them in his closet. And we knew that Greg Brown was killed in his closet. And we knew that there were some items that did not belong. The drills, the hammer, the Kel-Tec, and the cell phone. So we knew, and you could tell based on the evidence, that the drills would have come from Nicolas Lonard. And we now know that Nicolas Lonard may have gone over there, he may have brought his drills in to change the locks. Now, there's no indication that he actually changed the locks, because I'm sure when he gets there, Megan tells him, Adam Matos can pick locks. There's no sense in changing the locks. This lock, the next lock, it's all the same to him. But if Nick Lonard brought any hardware over, or certainly when he brought his drills over, it gives this defendant the opportunity to now change the lock to Tristan Drew, which he denies doing. But there is absolutely no reason why anyone else in that house would have done that. We know it had to be him, because that's the only method he can use to secure this child while he is going about wiping this crime scene of the evidence that will assist everybody in proving him guilty. And we know, unlike he wants you to believe from the stand, that this was happening during the night and the day. We know that Megan Brown's vehicle disappears during the morning, between 8:30 in the morning and 9:30 in the morning. Miss Ward, who came back and testified about another matter, told you very clearly, Saturday morning I got there, 8:30, we were all paying attention to Megan's car, we were all worried about her, it was there, and I was worried, and when I got back from my run, I passed by it, it was gone, and I was relieved. But anyway, so the firearm and the hammer, we knew, were the murder weapons. The hammer doesn't fit with everything else, and the hammer is also consistent with the deaths. Now, in regards to the hammer, this defendant, he's upset. He's obviously upset with Megan. He threatens her life in the morning. He leaves. According to him back then, he was asked to leave, and so he did. But he's still texting her. He's still obviously upset. There's still animosity there, such that Megan is still upset between 2 and 4 in the afternoon when she talks to Jimmy Sigler. But, excuse me, when this defendant comes back, there are multiple places where he could have obtained the hammer from without being in the house. He goes into that house knowing that he's going to kill these people, and he arms himself with a hammer. You either get it from Nicolas Lonard's truck, which is out there in the driveway, or if the defendant is accurate, which is a big if, across the street in the grassy area, or we see there are tools just lying around this house. There's a mallet and a board. There could have been a hammer in a lot of different locations surrounding this residence that this defendant would have had access to before he makes entrance. And we also know there are zip ties lying outside of the house, and there's zip ties in places in the residence where this defendant had easy access to them. We know the Caltech was Nicolas Lonard's. You can match up the serial number to the box, and I don't think we have any dispute about that. Now, we recovered 4 bullets, the one in Megan's head, the one under Greg, the one on the driveway, and the one in the trash. Now, the defendant says there was a 5th bullet. I wouldn't dispute that. We were under the impression there were 5 shots probably already. However, I don't agree with him that it occurred in southeast bedroom. So, we know when Margaret gets home, and the defendant has now admitted that she would have parked in the west garage. We knew that already because that's where the van was parked the morning of the 28th. We know a blood spatter expert came in and helped us decipher that Margaret was killed in this area, and the defendant has now admitted that that was what happened. So we're all in agreement about this, and we knew her blood was there. We see her handprint there. Now, I submit to you, the defendant, most likely, when Margaret Brown gets home, which he's going to know when that is, and clearly it is not long after she arrives because she is just walking in the door, this defendant is waiting there with the hammer and executes Margaret Brown.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Sure.
The objection is overruled. You may proceed.
Margaret Brown arrives home, and the defendant proceeds to beat her to death with a hammer immediately after she gets out of her vehicle. And you can see how this fight would have gone, or I say fight, but really it was an attack. Margaret Brown is getting to right in this area here. She gets beat. She starts bleeding. Her hands are going to go up on her head. She doesn't know what's happening, or doesn't realize. She just knows she's getting hit in the head by a very hard object as she realizes that the defendant is attacking her. She ends up getting blood on her hand, which the defendant agreed this was going to be Margaret Brown's handprint here. Remember, we couldn't get Margaret Brown's fingerprints because her hands were too decomposed, so we were unable to compare this print to anybody other than the defendant. We knew it wasn't his, but Margaret Brown's hands go up over her head, and now she's got blood on her hand as she falls against the wall, and you recall what Mrs. Cox said, that there's some impacts out of there that shows that she was hit very close to that wall. And then still hitting her as she's falling against the wall. And she's trying to get through this door. And you can see her mark right there. The defendant wants to claim that those are his fingers, but Margaret Brown's the one who has blood on her hand. Margaret Brown's the one that's going to be trying to pull her way to safety as this defendant drags her back into the east garage. And this diagram shows some of the areas that we see Margaret Brown's blood. And there we have a handprint right here on this wall. I have photographs of that later. Now I submit to you, most likely, based again on Justin Okins and Kristen Anderson's testimony, Margaret Brown gets home at 11:30, she gets attacked. Justin Okins and Kristen Anderson hear shots, and they estimate between 11:45 and midnight. That would be after Margaret Brown gets home, which would mean that the defendant takes the hammer and goes up the stairs and goes right for Nicolas Lonard. He's going to know Nicolas Lonard is there. Nicolas Lonard's truck is outside the residence with his name on it. So he knows what's going on. He also, and again, the defendant wants you to believe that he received a 22-minute phone call from Nicolas Lonard the night of the 27th, where Nicolas Lonard says, not interested in Meg anymore, but the defendant is still calling Nicolas Lonard after the incident in the morning with the knife, because Megan is not answering him. And we see Nicolas Lonard's blood throughout this room on various objects which appear to have been disturbed. We see his blood on the pillow and the carpet and on these containers, which the defendant has now admitted he moved down the west garage. Find it on the DVDs. Now you can see the DVDs would have come from that DVD case that is empty up in the southeast bedroom. The guy who's selling a TV, an entertainment center, dogs, jewelry, and a Bose speaker isn't selling any DVDs because he knows that DVDs could have blood on them because of how viciously he beat Nicolas Lonard. So those he's going to throw away. On the blanket, which, by the way, the blanket was in the same trash bag as the shirt the defendant was wearing on the first and the second. The sock, which, by the way, there's a bullet found in this trash bag, which I think I have some pictures of later. In this trash bag, we also have a sock with Nicolas Lonard's blood on it. Now, is Nicolas Lonard's DNA on a bullet? Yes, it is, according to FDLE. Is there a number of ways that could have gotten there? Absolutely. Nicolas Lonard could have loaded those bullets, since it was his gun, and also, more likely, is it was thrown away with this bloody sock. The defendant might have even used the bloody sock to pick up the bullet. Those boxes would have been taken from the southeast bedroom with Nicolas Lonard's blood on them. And then you have this transfer stain. Now, this transfer stain, before the defendant testified, would have still placed the defendant outside of this closet after Nicolas Lonard was beaten to death. How? Because the defendant would have gotten Nicolas Lonard's blood on his sock or on his foot, and as he's running and as he's standing there, the blood transfers. Now, there was probably more blood that transferred before this particular stain that was cleaned up, but this one largely remained. We were able to get Nicolas Lonard's blood off, or DNA from it, and that would have been the defendant standing there shooting Greg Brown. And again, the green ones, you can see different areas that we located Nicolas Lonard's blood, and obviously a large concentration in the southeast bedroom. Now we know there was a shot that came that went from that room, and a bullet that ended up outside. Now recall, what the defendant just told us was that he was on the bed with Nicolas Lonard when the gun went off. Well, that doesn't match the trajectory of where this goes from. And there are more photographs than this. If the bed is here, the gunshot's coming from over here. Why is that? Because the defendant is pushing Nicolas Lonard over in this area, and the two of them are fighting against the wall towards the closet. The defendant's statement is not accurate. It doesn't match the evidence. And we see the result of that bullet, the hole through the wall, all the way through the wall, with the bullet ending up on the driveway. Now, Greg Brown, we see we find a large stain of his blood deep within the closet. And we already knew, why is it going to be there? Because Greg Brown is going to be going, and there's some of his blood on the blanket. Greg Brown is going to be going for his weapons. Of course he is. And as I'll lay out later, I'll just lay it out right now. When the defendant comes out and attacks Nicolas Lonard, Nicolas Lonard's going to be there with Megan Brown. Megan Brown and Nicolas Lonard are going to be together in her bedroom, talking, doing whatever, being concerned about the defendant. And when this defendant comes in with a hammer and begins to viciously beat Nicolas Lonard, and blood's going everywhere. You heard Megan Brown on the 911 tape. She's going to get upset. She's going to freak out. And she's going to run to another source of protection to try and get some sort of, try and end this terrible situation. So she's going to run to the master bedroom and tell Greg. And Greg is undoubtedly going to try and go to defend himself with the weapons that he has in that closet. But he never gets out of that closet. There's no indication that he gets out of that closet. He's going for the weapons, and he gets shot in the back by this defendant. And you heard Dr. Palma talk about how that shot it lines up with the pelvis and would have been expected to hit the I think it was the pelvic aorta, but a major artery in that region. And in Dr. Palma's words, would have taken Greg down immediately. And the defendant, Greg's going to go down after that shot. Defendant admits he shot him in the back first. Greg goes down, and the defendant shoots him again to make sure he's dead or not getting back up. And then in Megan Brown's blood, we find that on the light switch, which that's a transfer stain, not as much information you can glean from that, but also these important stains near the bed, which Anna Cox told us was consistent with a blood spatter event, which was also consistent with what we would expect to see from a gunshot. And so we knew, Megan Brown's stains are in purple, we knew Megan Brown was killed in the master bedroom. And I agree with the defendant, she was probably hiding behind that wall. Whether the defendant was able to hit her through the corner in the left eye, that's a matter for you to decide, but I submit to you it is just as likely, possibly more likely, that he shot at that corner while she was near it, did not hit her, and then took a second shot at her, making sure to hit her right in the left eye. Which I would argue to you is would be the fifth shot. Now, we can see from the defendant's phone records, and I would note the defendant admitted that he deleted all his text messages to Megan during this period of time. You can see on the records that we were able to recover of the call log, which is only calls, not text messages, but it does match up with the calls that we see on his phone records. That the defendant was trying to reach her. We see on the call log within the phone, those are all deleted calls. The defendant tried to scrub his phone so that people would not know, would not be able to recover easily what his activities were like. And we see he called Megan Brown over and over, calls Nick 3 times during the night. At one point, they connect, and again, this is the defendant calling Nicolas Lonard. And they connect and talk for a long period of time. Nicolas Lonard apparently calls back, but notice it's a routed call, which I believe, and go with your own memories.
May we approach?
Overruled. You may proceed.
And my recollection of the testimony was that the Sprint custodian indicated that a routed call goes to voicemail. If I'm mistaken on that, go with your own memories. Quite frankly, it's not a huge issue one way or the other. But the defendant continues to try and reach Megan all through the night. Again, you can see you number all these attempts at contact. We're at 174 by 4:30 in the morning. And ultimately, by my count, 191 attempts that this defendant makes to contact Megan Brown before she would arrive back, and he, in his words, doesn't assault her with a knife, but just brings it out to make her tell the truth. And we see shortly after that would have happened, that the defendant is trying to contact Nicolas Lonard, which, again, under his testimony, wouldn't make a lot of sense because he indicated he was under the impression that Nicolas Lonard was done. I submit to you that the evidence suggests that that is not the case. The evidence suggests that Nicolas Lonard's contact with this defendant, which was initiated by this defendant, is in a long line of this defendant harassing Megan Brown while she's out with friends that night, and any conversation more likely would have been consistent with what we know Nicolas Lonard was doing on the 28th, with being protective of Megan Brown. Don't call her anymore. Why are you bothering her? Stop harassing her. So we know what happens at 6 in the morning. And the 911 tape is in evidence. You can review it again. It's possible you will hear it during the course of closing arguments. But we know what Megan Brown said. We know how she said it. She was clearly afraid, clearly concerned. She indicated very clearly that the defendant had threatened to kill her and that her finger had been cut in the process. The evidence that we see in the room and on Ms. Brown suggests that that is completely accurate. And now, when you add to that what the defendant does admit to, it seemed was absolutely completely accurate. Because what the defendant said about this, I submit to you, is just not believable. So that incident occurs, and then the defendant continues to contact Megan, Margaret, Megan, Margaret, Nick. Again, he's contacting Nick at 7 o'clock in the morning, an hour after that would have the knife incident, and many hours after, he claimed on stand to you guys that he thought Nick didn't want to have anything else to do with Megan. More contacts, and then at 4:12 we see he never tries to call any of them again. Now, 4:12, he makes that call after a long period of time, a couple hours of not trying to contact them, but then you can see a whole lot of activity on August 29th that you now know is people shopping on Craigslist. So, in terms of how the defendant went about doing this, you see that he killed all 4 of these people, and whether he planned how he was going to clean it up and get away with it beforehand or not is not relevant. It doesn't matter if he planned how he's going to get away with it in advance or not, but clearly after he does it, he does have a semblance of a plan. Doesn't mean it's a good plan, Doesn't have to mean it's a smart plan, but he was trying to cover up his crime. He was trying to cover up his crime. Now he wants to tell you, and he tried to tell you, tried to get out as many times as he could, that, oh, I was just doing that to, I was just trying to do that because I didn't want Tristan to be exposed to that. But we can see from the evidence that that is not the case. There are plenty of ways to have prevented Tristan from coming into contact with any of this, probably best of which would have been to call law enforcement if any part of what he said was true. But he didn't do that. He tries to begin to clean the scene. And he killed 4 people in there in violent and horrible ways. This is not an easy scene or a quick scene to clean. He's trying to, the next day, he's selling items. He's trying to sell items to generate money, because as we established, he didn't have much money of his own. If he takes the van, somebody might recognize the license plate eventually, because he does know, he's got to know that eventually people are going to be looking for these individuals. And if he ends up with one of their vehicles in another state or far away, there are going to be questions about that. So he needs an exit plan, and that involves getting money. Whether it's a taxi, a bus, a plane in the future, he is going to have to get money. But if he can also erase all signs of the crime, get the bodies out, eliminate the blood spatter evidence, then it will be much harder to detect. And we went excruciatingly over blood spatter and blood stains and things that we found in the house. But there was still a lot of things missing. There was a lot of stains. There was a lot of areas that were significantly clean. Now, we talked about this lock already, and we know morning the 28th it looks one way, September 4th looks another way. This is where Tristan is going to be. Now, whether that lock came from this door or not, don't know. It's odd that there's a door there with no hardware. And it certainly would make sense for a garage door to have a door lock of this nature that you can lock from either side. And we know that those keys, because we asked the forensics people, the keys there go to that door. So this is where the defendant is putting Tristan. Tristan is in his room with his toys where he cannot get out into the crime scene and disrupt the defendant's cleaning activities or make it more difficult to clean. He dumps everything in the canal, and recall there were 2 unspent rifle cartridges. Now we know the defendant's got to be dumping this stuff late at night. We know that it would be most likely dark, and he couldn't have realized, certainly wouldn't have realized, otherwise he would have kicked them into the canal, that 2 shell case or 2 unspent cartridges dropped. That clued law enforcement in to search the canal. Possibly would have searched the canal anyway, but those indicate, hey, there's something in there we got to look for. So he disposed of all the weapons, the murder weapons. He disposes of the drills, which I submit to you, he used the drills to change the lock. He knew the drills belonged to Nicolas Lonard. He wants to erase all signs of Nicolas Lonard in the house, so he has to throw the drills away. Otherwise, what's he doing with all the other items of value? He's selling them on Craigslist. Like, he doesn't want any signs of Nicolas Lonard to tie him, to be tied to this residence, because that will help establish the things the defendant did. Now, of note is that in addition to the knives and the weapons and the drills, is the cell phone. The cell phone that we find in the canal. The cell phone that's not going to be a problem for Tristan if he comes across that. That's not going to create issues. And he doesn't just throw the cell phone in the canal. He makes sure that it is smashed beyond recovery when he does it. And even if he doesn't say, oh, maybe I did that out of anger, because there is no explanation for that. He is trying to make sure that any of the communications he had with either Nicolas Lonard or Megan Brown, I submit to you that one was probably Megan Brown's, because I believe he agreed with that those communications to Megan Brown cannot be recovered. He's mopping, he's taking bodies down the stairs. And if you look at the master bedroom, and we now all agree that Megan Brown was shot in this master bedroom, it is significantly cleaned up. If you just walk in there and you're not looking for the bullet hole or you're not looking specifically for bloodstains, you might never know that there was a person who was shot in here. Fortunately, the forensics team did a good job, and they did find some bloodstains that the defendant failed to get rid of. Now, he was a bit unlucky here in the master bedroom closet. There's a bloodstain that is going to be very difficult to remove from this unfinished wood. And whether he tried or not, it's unclear, but you can see that there's clothing items that appear to be missing, probably went out in the trash on Tuesday, September 2nd. But these are the first two areas this defendant would have been cleaning up. And I submit to you, before September 2nd, this was his first focus. These are largely going to be the trash bags that he's filling up. These are going to be items that we can never recover again. And after this, he moves. And again, indications of cleaning where blood would have been. And this one's actually the southeast bedroom. You see indications of cleaning supplies throughout the residence. And you see, again, now we all agree the bodies were here for a period of time, ultimately piled into the van. It's very obvious bodies have been in due to the maggots and the decomposition. And on the stand, he told you, yeah, you didn't know why he brought the shovel. But I submit to you all, we all know why he brought the shovel, because when he got out to Old Dixie Highway, probably still thinking he was going to bury them, and either it was raining or too dark, or he just got lazy about it and decided not to do it. Or, actually, if he had tried, we know this is an area of lime rock. There's actually a lime rock mine up beyond this burn. Even if he had tried to bury the bodies out there, he was not going to be successful. So he just left it. And this trash bag that was found in the rug, these are clearly all items that he cleaned out of the van. Again, more activity that he's doing to make sure that he is able to cover up his crime sufficiently. He's moving all of these items out of the van. You see car chargers, Wawa hats. One of them is probably the Wawa hat that Margaret left in the Wawa on the 28th. So he scoops all these items out of the back so that he can pull down the seats and pile in the bodies. And I submit to you that after cleaning out the master bedroom fairly well, he is now turning his attention to the southeast bedroom. This is going to be his next area, and there's a lot to clean up in here. And we see evidence of this cleaning down in the west garage where he's already taken the mattress, cut the mattress top off, moved the DVDs. You can see where the DVDs would have come from. Items of clothing that would be consistent with Megan's clothing, the plastic set of drawers, the boxes that say Megan and Tristan on them. All of those are things he would have had to move down from here, and which he is slowly cleaning this room. But he hadn't gotten that far. And you see those different items here in the west garage. The boxes, the mattress pad. Oh, by the way, Ben says he needs to get money, he needs to use credit cards. Why? Because he has to feed Tristan. I have to feed Tristan. Well, the case of Yingling beer was not feeding Tristan. And you see the case of Yingling beer that you can also see the defendant carrying out of Winn-Dixie. The trash bags of DVDs, again, as I showed you, those would have come from that southeast bedroom. The clothing, again, women's clothing, consistent with what you would expect Megan Brown to have. Cleaning supplies, trash bags would have come from, again, DVDs would have come from those racks. Nicolas Lonard's blood. Now, and you cut this off, you didn't want people to see the blood. Again, couldn't have anything to do with Tristan then. And he indicated, well, if somebody saw the blood, I was afraid someone was going to come and kill me. Again, just not very credible testimony. He is trying to erase the signs of his crimes. Megan's vehicle We know that that ends up there sometime August 30th between 8:30 and 9:30. There's a given ward. We can see where the defendant probably would have placed his bicycle that he used to go get the vehicle. We now all agree that the mattress would have come from the southeast bedroom. We talked about that bullet. That Colonial Electric t-shirt, and you'll note, he was wearing the same clothes on both the first and the second, Monday and Tuesday. We have surveillance video of him in both, and then he just throws away this shirt. Now, we tested this shirt to see if we could find any evidence on it. You recall there was no blood or DNA that was able to be recovered. But he didn't know that. He didn't know we wouldn't be able to recover anything. And if he's cleaning up this stuff using this shirt, or probably not moving bodies by then, but maybe cleaning up where the bodies were, then he's going to want to dispose of the shirt so that we cannot necessarily tie it to him. Again, it's all about erasing the indications of his offense. You see him there in the shirt. And also you can see Brian McCann's truck. You see the license plate there. All that matches up. And again, here's the blanket. This blanket with Nicolas Lonard's blood on it is found in the same trash bag as that shirt. So even before he admitted to cleaning up the scene, we knew it was him cleaning up the scene. Dumps the bodies, and there's no telling whether he attempted to dig out this area now. So you can see that shovel. You can look at that shovel, and you can see that there's dirt caked, or some type of, it looks like lime rock caked on that shovel. It is more likely from this area, and areas like this with these puddles here on the lime rock, than it is from that shallow dirt hole that we know the defendant dug. We knew the van was used to transport the bodies. And again, there's indication, lime rock and dirt consistent with what you would expect from this area where the bodies were dumped, which clearly again showed that Mr. Matos used the van in order to do that. So Mr. Matos now agrees that this is exactly what he was trying to do out there, was to bury the bodies, again, trying to erase indications of his criminal offense. So we had him tied to the shovel, we had him buying the shovel, we had the shovel where the bodies were, and we had the sticker in the grave. Now, we also saw him, Sharon Mann saw him using the hose in just within the door of this area. The door would be right here that Sharon Mann saw Mr. Matos spraying this area out of. Again, this is on the 3rd. He's still cleaning all the way to the 3rd. The whole time he's just trying to erase all of the evidence, erase all signs of the horrible murders that he committed. And there you can see what it looks like if we just overlay them. Now I point out again, the defendant has admitted to being there the whole time, but we had him there with the IP address. His phone is using the Craigslist. The Craigslist is connecting to the IP address that's assigned to the house. The Google Mail accounts are being accessed from his house, the Google Mail accounts. We have pictures of the Ryan Smith 694 account on his phone, so clearly he set that up on the 2nd, either because he was unable to continue to use the Matos Adam email address because of posting puppies, or because he was now trying to, hey wait, maybe I should not be using my name to sell all of these items. But selling all the items in order to generate money. So there's also a lot of dishonesty that we get from the defendant over the course of these days. With the McCanns, he tells them that all these people, or the Browns anyway, have gone to West Virginia. He brings up surveillance video, and you know, Shakespeare and Hamlet, some of you may know the quote, "The lady doth protest too much." An indication that there's too the defendant tried too hard to explain some things in this case. He gave explanations that were that's not at all reasonable. An example of that, the surveillance video. He's asking Ryan McCann about the surveillance video. Why is he doing that? He's trying to gauge whether or not there's any possibility that he was caught on camera disposing of the murder weapons. When I ask him about it, it's not out of the blue anymore. There's this, which Ryan McCann came back and testified, completely inaccurate account that Ryan McCann had hidden cameras of some sort and was creating porn videos. It's just not credible. Dishonesty there. When the law enforcement officers come into contact with him, you see dishonesty there. He now admits that what he told law enforcement, that he didn't even know they were dead, that he wasn't there, that he stayed on the streets, all of that was inaccurate. In fact, you can see attempts to, his attempts to avoid being caught with the taxi driver. What name does he give the taxi driver? He gives the taxi driver the name Jake. Well, let's talk about the name Jake as it relates to this defendant. What does he tell Detective Kugel? He tells Detective Kugel on the 28th he stayed at Jake's house. Well, we now know there was no Jake. We also know that the defendant uses an email address for Craigslist called Jake VNS0. This defendant uses the name of Jake as an alias. So, again, deception. Deception with the taxi driver, deception with Detective Kugel, and he couldn't use the name Jake when he checks into the Florida because they require ID. He had to use his own name. The taxi driver didn't, and that's why he gives him a fake name. The Tampa Bay Times. Nobody forced him to talk to Tampa Bay Times. Nobody, I'm sure nobody told him it was a good idea to talk to Tampa Bay Times, but he goes out of his way to accept an interview with them, sit down with them, and again, sells them a story. Now remember, at that point, he has no idea all the evidence that law enforcement is gathering against him. By the time he testified to you all today, he had heard all the evidence that we had put up this past 2 weeks against him. And he can now craft...
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yeah. Overruled.
He is now able to craft an explanation that, in his mind, matches the evidence. But when he's talking to the Tampa Bay Times, he doesn't yet know that we're going to be able to tie him to that house and to all those things. He doesn't know that. So he denies being there. And then, of course, when law enforcement does arrive, there is him fleeing the house. He flees the house. He stays in the backyard. He uses the canoe, just like we already knew from the testimony. And they drive right by the crime scene. He knows what's going on there. He's trying to get away because now he can't stay and clean the house anymore. Law enforcement's there. He was too slow on that already. So now he just needs to distance himself from the crime scene. And that's what he does. And, of course, when Detective Cooper and Detective Kennedy sit down with them and they ask him, hey, the defendant says, I want my son to go with my brother or with my mother. And Detective Cooper says, well, what about Megan? It would be nice if you could go with Megan. He says, could that happen? He says, I wouldn't know. And you can watch it in the interview, if the interview is in evidence. And then Detective Kennedy follows up with, what about Megan's parents? And he says, I don't know. You can call them. And he knows full well that their cell phones are sitting in the kitchen of Hatteras Drive, and Greg and Margaret are lying dead at the end of Old Dixie Highway. Again, deception and cover-up. Now you're going to be instructed on what justifiable use of deadly force would be. Defendant clearly used deadly force, and as I went over briefly with you at the beginning, even by his own account, these would not be justified. There's no self-defense claims, reasonable claims here. And the use of deadly force is justifiable if the defendant reasonably believed, again, reasonably believed that the force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself while resisting another's attempt to murder him, or any attempt to commit felony battery upon or in any dwelling occupied by him. Now, we heard from Kim Ward, Nicolas Lonard is well known at the Fisherman's Shack, and he's well known to be a peaceful person. Kind of guy who would stop a fight, not start a fight. And you heard from Robert Dunleavy, who said Nick was going over there with his firearm because out of concern for Megan from the incident in the morning, and he was bringing the firearm because if he was threatened, because we all know what the defendant did that morning, Nicolas Lonard knew what the defendant did that morning, and recognized the defendant could be dangerous. And in fact, the defendant was dangerous when he came back. So I submit to you, it would not be in Nicolas Lonard's character, it would not be expected of him to just, out of the blue, as the defendant wants to tell you, he walks in, nobody says anything to anybody, and suddenly Nicolas Lonard attacks him. That is not reasonable and is not supported by the circumstances. Certainly, it's not even close for Gregory Brown, Megan Brown, and not even a sparkle in the eye in the situation with Margaret Brown. Adam Matos was justified in using deadly force if he reasonably, and see, you're going to note that that word reasonably appears over and over again in the justifiable use of deadly force instruction. Reasonably believed that such force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. If Adam Matos was not otherwise engaged in criminal activity and was in a place he had a right to be, then he had no duty to retreat and had a right to stand his ground. Now, no duty to retreat and standing your ground are not the same thing as running after a person and shooting them in the closet. They are completely different. They're not the same thing as stalking somebody in a garage and beating them about the head when they are unarmed and just returning home from work. It's not even close. Now, it is notable, and I bring to your attention, both Margaret and Nick have injuries that were blunt force and incised wounds, sharp object wounds. And as the defendant has now agreed, at least partially with Nick, all those can be explained, all those types of injuries can be explained with a hammer. Because you have one side that's blunt and another side, before it's in the canal and rusted, which can be very sharp. It can be almost knife sharp in some instances. And again, with Justin Oken's testimony, that's why I submit to you it is more likely that the defendant kills Margaret first and then goes up and kills the rest of those people. But he starts out with a hammer, and he continues with the hammer until he's able to get Nicolas Lonard's firearm, and then he switches to the firearm for the last two. I submit to you that it's not as reasonable the other way. But either way, the defendant is still guilty of murdering all four of these people. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, when you look at the circumstances, when you listen to the 911 call of a scared and afraid Megan Brown, whose life had just been threatened at knife point by this defendant, when you look at the circumstances of how these crimes were committed, the multiple blows, the multiple shots in some situations, and ultimately the fairly immediate attempt to obscure what occurred and cover up what happened and deceive about where he was when it happened, it all points to one thing, and that is this defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree for killing Margaret Brown, murder in the first degree for killing Nicolas Lonard, murder in the first degree for killing Greg Brown, and murder in the first degree for killing Megan Brown. Thank you.